In high school, I knew a strange duck named Stapp Beaton. In our conservative Houston school, Stapp cut a very striking figure: iconic trench coat, long hair, tiny glasses, walking with exaggerated lateral movements that advertised his probable marijuana use. He was 3 years ahead of me, and the both of us were active in policy debate, which we took a little more seriously than breathing. Stapp was a singularly brilliant debater, fast and funny and clever and irreverent, and also likely the single most charismatic person I'd ever met. People reacted to him like he was an addictive drug, overjoyed when he was there, despondent when he left. People would tell me that I looked just like him, or maybe like a shorter, less compelling version of him, with a weaker chin. On the upside, there were a handful of girls who settled for me when he was unavailable. I remember thinking that if he died, nobody would ever believe he existed. Certainly, I looked up to him. After high school, Stapp failed out of 2 or 3 colleges. I'm going to go out on a limb and say because he wasn't studying. Before he settled into Austin as a convenience store clerk. Meanwhile, I went out to Pomona College to prepare for law school. Out in LA, I thrived and remained on track, skirting trouble and graduating early. What I really wanted to do was write, but it didn't really fit into my life. In the summers, Stapp and his roommates invited me to stay with them in Austin, where I delivered pizza and called out phone surveys. These jobs weren't exactly resume builders, a fact gently called to my attention by my mother and maybe less gently by my advisor in college. But in Stapp's house, I was a real striver. Stapp's home had 7 residents, 2 bedrooms, and no AC. The Austin summers were merciless, so there was a lot of nudity and a lot of ranting. Ranting season began about 9 p.m. and lasted till about 4 a.m., depending on the supply of beer or, in difficult times, triple sec. Stapp would rant eloquently about Stalinism and the Book of Job and consciousness and space-based anti-satellite weapons and imperialism. And in the morning, he apologized for pissing in the sink. The rants were transfixing, and so were the passionate, interesting people that drifted in to watch them. I was especially happy to find my friend Kim in attendance, although she was only in Austin because she too had dropped out of college. Kim was my high school prom date. She had kicked me around in debate, and it's fair to say I harbored a crush. But that ended this one day that she got real high and listened to me speak and told me she was in my voice. From then on, anything romantic would have been a letdown, as though there had been a kind of sex of words and thoughts that I didn't want to cheapen with the physical kind. Which, to be clear, had probably not been on the table. Anyway, on paper, I was maybe a little out of place in Stapp's house. A large proportion of the people I met there had a drug problem or an untreated mental disorder. Some had both. I had neither. But I wanted to stay in this electric scene among people who relentlessly question the world, people that might one day be worth writing about. I was afraid that my path, professional school, professional gig, would eventually commit me to a world devoid of community and personality. And maybe, on some level, being there made me feel like a comparatively high achiever. In the spring of my junior year, I called and asked after Stapp. A roommate told me in ominous tones that he was hanging out with Rob a lot. I knew who Rob was, another gifted former debater, and I didn't understand why this information should concern me. But a month or 2 later, I learned that Rob had become addicted to heroin. Rob's father confined him to the country to sober up, even disabling his vehicle. But Rob repaired the vehicle and drove to Austin for heroin. Then he took his cats to the SPCA and jumped off the I-35 overpass. I phoned Stapp, but studiously avoided mentioning Rob's death. So I guess we talked about writing a screenplay together or some shit. I only remember how Stapp closed that conversation. "Well, Jolie," he said, "now that Rob's gone, it's incumbent on all of us to redouble our efforts." I had exactly 0 idea what the hell he was talking about, really, but I accepted it as a promise to live and to find something to live for. I didn't ask whether he was using too. It turned out that Rob would only be the first of several ducks to fall. In the years between my junior year in college and my second year in law school at UT, my friends from that house dropped off the conveyor belt at the steady rhythm of about a duck a year. Next was Stapp's idol, John. John had been a spectacular debater, but by the time I knew him, schizophrenia and unemployment had reduced him to peeing on the genitals of strangers behind the H-E-B for cash. John's parents checked him into a mental institution, and when he checked out, he killed himself. My first year in law school, it was Kim's turn. I saw her just before she killed herself, and she seemed scattered, like she was on something speedy. Then a year later, it was Mike, one of the original roommates in Stapp's house. He'd driven home after drinking at his bouncer job in 6th Street, then impaled himself on his motorcycle handlebars. Each time I got one of those someone killed themselves calls, I was astonished to learn that it wasn't about Stapp, who'd been developing an impressive heroin addiction of his own. Distance grew between us. I'd catch him walking alone on the street, where he'd ask me for $2. I watched him high out of his mind at a sit-in while we were occupying a university administration building. I heard stories of his girlfriend tracking him to East Austin motels, where he'd disappear for weeks. He stayed in my house for a weekend in law school, promising sobriety. But when he left, the bathroom yielded up blood-dotted cotton balls. By the time Mike died, Stapp was in recovery. He'd done his first jail sentence for possession and began going to AA meetings. He drove me to sushi for Mike's wake, insisting that I ride in the trunk, as Mike would have wanted. I declined. Stapp tried to write a eulogy for Mike that night, but it wasn't his best work. He became depressed and drank, which scared and disappointed me, but I didn't comment. In January of 2004, I was about to become a public defender, maybe inspired by my visits to Stapp in jail. I traveled to Houston to see him and found him very, very closely focused on beating his addiction. In 2 days, he went to 2 AA meetings. On the trails around the bayou, he told me how many of his interests had to be discarded to focus on sobriety. AA, he said, was totalitarian, an ideology that displaced all other interests. So maybe he actually did take his addiction seriously. That was a gift that he gave to me, to hear him vocalize everything I wished I had the courage to say to him about the reckless way he was living his life. A month after that trip, he was picked up on an old warrant from Austin and incarcerated. I bonded him out, prompting him to leave a voicemail expressing his appreciation. His exact words were, "Paige, I know where you live, and it's hard to walk without kneecaps." And then a month after that, he scored an unusually pure batch of heroin and overdosed in his grandparents' house. Jesus Christ, did I fucking weep. I don't think that was guilt. It's true that I was the last one to bond him out of jail, and that he couldn't have gotten the fatal packet if he'd been inside. But that's just happenstance, isn't it? Right? So I don't think it was guilt. I think it was just plain loss. So long as he lived, it was impossible to forget that human beings possess a spark of something ineffable, some kind of electricity or flame that can only be transferred interpersonally. So long as he lived, access to a spiritual life was as easy as entering the room with him. And then he was gone. This bolt of lightning, masquerading as a human being, had vanished. I don't know if I'm living the way I feared I would back then, isolated, focused on work, ignoring the ideas that I used to care about. But it does take special effort, redoubled efforts, to find that strange electric flame that animated him, Often I look for it by trying to do the writing I never did when he was alive. But sometimes it is necessary to look more directly, to stop everything, and merely scour the world before my eyes for whatever tiny remnants of lightning have been left behind.